If you're looking to stay informed with the latest analysis on the stories that are shaping our world in the areas of foreign policy, national security, and domestic politics, consider becoming a member of the DSR Network. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode across our more than 10 shows features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the latest topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code JULY2024 to receive 50% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code JULY2024. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. This week, a quote from J.D. Vance surfaced in which he described Kamala Harris and other Democratic leaders as a bunch of childless cat ladies and spun out a whole theory of the moment based on this inane notion. Perhaps the best response to this came from Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who sharply dressed down Vance for poking his nose into the business of other people's family decisions. We think this is an important moment. With this response, Buttigieg showed that Vance has invited a much larger national conversation about women's rights, about family planning, and about, frankly, Vance's own pretty weird views on gender. And this is not a good conversation for Vance and Donald Trump to have. Today we're talking about all this with Melissa Gira-Grant, a staff writer at the New Republic, who wrote a good piece recently explaining Vance's views on all these matters. Good to have you on, Melissa.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Just to set the scene, Vance went on Tucker Carlson's show in July 2021 and said this country is effectively run by, quote, a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable and want to make the rest of the country miserable too. Then he cited Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, and said the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children, which means they don't have a stake in the country's future. This has now created a huge cultural firestorm. Melissa, why do you think it touched such a chord?
For Vance right now to have to sort of introduce himself in a different way, right, as a vice presidential candidate, I think it's the exactly perfect moment to dig back into his past statements. This one was just, even at the time, I think sort of calculated to troll people. And he's talked about that, about he loves to troll. Sometimes he's telling the truth when he's trolling. And the cat ladies thing, I mean, it's just vicious and stupid. I don't know how else to put it. Like it's something that is very easy to react to viscerally. And then once you get into the beat of what he's saying, it's even worse. I think Vance struck such a nerve because what he is objecting to is just so painfully average, right? The idea of being a stepmother, the idea of adopting kids, not having kids, like this is stretching very far into sort of a, Christian dystopia to say that only people who reproduce apparently can run this country or have a stake in this country. I can't imagine that was ever all that popular, to be honest. But right now, I feel like we're, especially with the Harris candidacy, we're in a moment of really revisiting what it is to be a leader, who is a leader, who has a stake in this country. Like, he sounds like he's speaking from beyond the past. And it's jarring. I think that's the other reason people are responding to it. It just feels like, how could you even think that somebody should be in the White House who holds these views? It's just beyond.
Absolutely. So here's how Buttigieg responded to Vance on CNN.
The really sad thing is he said that after Chasten and I had been through a fairly heartbreaking setback in our adoption journey. He couldn't have known that, but maybe that's why you shouldn't be talking about other people's children. And it's not about his kids or my kids or the vice president's family. It's about your family, people's families whose well-being will depend on whether we go into a future led by somebody like Kamala Harris, who is focused on expanding the prosperity, the freedom, the well-being of our families. And by the way, especially if you have kids and you're worried about climate, choosing between a party that has a plan on climate that creates jobs and a party that still calls it a hoax, even as we went through the hottest day in world history. Or do you want your children to grow up in a country defined by a return to the chaos and recrimination and cruelty that was the hallmark of the Trump era?
So Buttigieg and his partner adopted 2 kids after that Vance quote. I thought Buttigieg's response was really artful. He basically said, look, these are really personal decisions, and you really shouldn't be cavalier about them. You never know what's going on with other people's private lives. I think intuitively that's going to be the response of a lot of people in the middle of the electorate. What's your take?
Buttigieg is not somebody I think of as getting into it all that eloquently when people are trolling him. I mean, I feel like this was a nice moment for him. He and his partner, his husband, Chasten, had been very public once they did adopt their children, who are twins, what that journey was like, why it was difficult. It's not a secret. And similarly, Vice President Harris is the stepmother to her husband's children, and she's written about what it is to be the mamala and how she values that relationship. I don't think the response is, if only you knew our families, you'd know we're normal just like you. I think the response is like, our families are families like everyone has, and how dare you start poking around in how we've made our families and are trying to score points off of that, right? Which is all that it is.
Right. He really, and he did it in such a sort of deft way. I mean, the basic point was, in addition to what you said, it's also how dare you insinuate that my family, if just because it's not the same as your family, is inferior to yours in some sense, or not in keeping with some sort of larger natural or religious order.
Right. That's the point he's trying to score. It's kind of pretend that he's not, right? Like he's making a value statement, Vance is, that these kinds of families are inferior, they're less than, and the people who have these families are themselves inferior and less than, which is, I think, very difficult maybe to digest in a 30-second clip, but to be able to just sort of succinctly talk about it as like, this is my life. How dare you start poking into my life?
So Vance's visible anger at the quote-unquote childless cat ladies is rooted in an actual worldview. He's zealously anti-abortion, and he's a natalist who's deeply worried about America's low fertility rates. He's also a nationalist and a big immigration restrictionist. But as you wrote in your recent piece, underneath those specific policy positions is a big idea that to be part of the American project, you really should procreate. So when he says that childless Democrats don't have a stake in our natural future, that's sort of what he's saying. Can you take us through this larger worldview of his?
Yeah, I would summarize it. There's 2 pieces to it. One is that real Americans procreate, right? In order to belong to the American project, you have to produce children. And the other piece of that is only real Americans ought to procreate. I don't think it's an accident that the people who are the unbelonging Americans that Vance goes after, 2 of them are women of color and 1 of them is a gay man, right? I mean, that's the not so quiet subtext of this entire project, because, if you read something like the Project 2025 sections on family, they're very clear that the family as they see it is 1 man, 1 woman who are married, and the children that they are raising that they bore. I mean, Vance is running around with people who are happy to say IVF. No, that's not real. That's not a real family, and we don't think you should have access to that. People who are even denying contraceptive access. Like, this is a degree of control over people's sexuality and family making that is incredibly disgusting. the other piece of it, though, is saying that there are certain people, and it's always non-white people in Vance's universe, who should not be procreating. It's super complicated by the fact that Vance's wife is the daughter of Indian immigrants to the United States. He would reject the idea that he could be racist. He's even said, how dare you, with our 3 beautiful biracial babies, I think is the way that he put it in a debate. But you could be pushing this view that only the right people should be procreating in the United States, and only those people have the stake in the country in order to rule the country. That in of itself is a white nationalist idea. It can be coming from people of color. There are people in the Republican camp who I think would agree with these kinds of statements. It's something that is not just about Vance is a white man and he's saying this. I think his idea of America is where people like him get to make these decisions for everyone else. People like him get to define who a family is. It's about power. And I'm sure that he would say that, he decided to have the family he's having, and that should have no bearing on all of this, right? It's so nice for him to be able to be like, no, not my family. Don't go poking into my family, which is, I think why Buttigieg's comment was well put.
Really good point. He feigns a whole lot of outrage and brings up his own family in order to insulate himself, but from attacks. But he's perfectly willing to go out and just mock and ridicule in really despicable terms the decisions of others along these lines. I want to get into a big picture aspect of this, which you also wrote about in your piece. All this stuff is what makes Vance a key to the new right. These figures have a more rigid view of social and gender hierarchy to begin with, but also they fully believe in using state power to facilitate the traditional family as the building block of the nation, like the pure fundamental building block of the nation. So they sort of envision the world carved up into these blocks that are, I guess, internally pure from an ethno-nationalist perspective. Those constitute the real essential nations. And so that's why maintaining a robust birth rate, which we should all contribute to, of course, by procreating, or we're not, doing our part, is tantamount to keeping the nation strong, right? Can you talk about this larger set of ideas and how it links up to Viktor Orban's Hungary and other international members of this global movement?
Yeah, we're really living in a moment of backlash globally. Orban is a perfect example. Putin would be another example. This idea that we need to control the birth rate, we need to control who is reproducing and the conditions under which they reproduce in order to have a healthy country. I think Vance said a healthy ruling class. He was even more specific.
He did say that.
That there's this correlation between the health of the family, the health of the nation. You see a lot of this rhetoric echoed, and when you'll hear things like drag queens are a threat to children, to children's innocence. There's a lot of loaded stuff going on here around sexuality and innocence, sex is for procreation. Children ought to be totally shielded from that. It's deep. It goes beyond just gender and sexuality because it does have this nationalistic component to it. They're going hand in hand. It's echoing also the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which we are seeing not just in the United States, but also playing out in rhetoric coming out of Hungary. This idea that these unfavorable, non-belonging people, immigrants, migrants, or even invaders sometimes in Trump's parlance, are threatening the makeup of the nation. They are not the people who should be coming and adding to the birth rate. They do not count. They're poisoning the blood, as Trump put it. And then there's this other twist to it that Vance kind of hides behind, this idea that Democrats want an open border, which we don't have, and I don't think Democrats want that. This idea that, this is a purposeful scheme. This is to get more Democratic voters into the country, right? To have immigrants come in and flood the voter rolls. And that's how they're going to hold on to power. And that, I think, should be understood as another facet of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Though Vance tries to hide behind that and make it just about voting. It really, I don't think it's unfair to make comparisons to American neo-Nazis also, like they are the ones who took up the banner from Hitler and have coined this phrase that you see all the time, sometimes referred to as just the 14 words because it's a really horrible phrase, but I'll say it just so people have it. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. And Vance and these others are saying that just without the word white. And it's the same, it's accomplishing the same thing, right? It's saying that we must procreate in order to have a future for us. The we and the us might be implicit, but when you hear the rest of his politics, it's like, oh, okay, you're talking about guys like you, guys like Peter Thiel, guys like Curtis Yarvin, guys like Donald Trump. You are the ones who get to decide who is in and who is out. And those are the only real Americans, according to you. Like, not only are those the only real Americans, but you get to decide who the real Americans are.
You just hit on an obsession of mine, so I'm going to have to detour into it. It's the great replacement stuff. So it's true that Vance does hide behind this idea that all he's really talking about is that Democrats just want to replace native-born voters with immigrants who happen to be non-white. But the thing about that is that these types of theories kind of exist on a spectrum, right? And so there are sort of versions of it that they can adopt, which give them a tiny bit of plausible deniability about their deeper implications, but which they also know will trigger a recognition of the deeper implications in their audiences, right? And so I just want to put this out there. So if J.D. Vance angrily rejects the idea that his great replacement talk is about race, then maybe someone should just ask him, do you agree with your running mate's claim that migrants are poisoning the blood of the United States? Yes or no? And then that would settle it, wouldn't it?
Vance doesn't do well when he's challenged on this. In a debate during his 2022 campaign for the U.S. Senate, the moderator of the debate, his challenger, Tim Ryan, they both push him on this. This great replacement conspiracy theory is pushed by white supremacists. You are associating yourself with white supremacists by pushing this belief. And he didn't have a great response. He didn't even really reject it. All he would say is, it's disgusting, and I've never endorsed it. It's disgusting, and such an unbelievable accusation. He was more outraged that someone would say it about him than the idea that, it exists, right? This belief itself, he couldn't quite bring himself to say, I reject this. And I think this goes to your point of the kind of dog whistle quality of this, right? He knows for him to reject it is to perhaps lose some of the appeal that he has to voters who share those xenophobic and racist views. And he would not do it when he was pushed. And I think he should absolutely be pushed again when we see him in a debate.
Yeah, I sure hope so. I mean, he's going to be more outraged about being questioned about it than he's going to be outraged by his own running mate's direct claim that migrants poison the blood of the United States. I want to go back to Buttigieg's answer for a second. It kind of shows that this conversation is bad for Vance and Trump. I think most normie voters will react badly to the suggestion that to be really American, you have to contribute genetically to its future and be part of a quote-unquote traditional family. It's kind of deeply disrespectful to people who make other choices, LGBTQ, single, all the, adopt people who adopt all the different permutations you ran through earlier. I think the key here is that Buttigieg, without saying that exactly directly, really communicated that basic thought very well, that Vance was being just profoundly disrespectful towards his fellow Americans. How do you think moderate and independent voters will hear this kind of back and forth between these two guys?
It's kind of hard to say, because I feel like this isn't something that I can even point to, polling around. How do you feel about family composition? But we do know that, families who use IVF, either because they want to or because they can't otherwise reproduce, families who adopt, families who, include stepkids and kids of other parents, families who are co-parenting even though they're divorced, these cut across political lines. And I think what it reminds me of is the outrage in Alabama and nationally, but the outrage to the Alabama Supreme Court's decision that essentially put IVF out of reach because it put so many burdens on clinics to, ensure that frozen embryos were not destroyed, because the Supreme Court decided that a frozen embryo is a life with all of the same protections as any other life. That was outrageous to people because people need IVF. It is an incredibly difficult process. It's an incredibly difficult decision. And it's not a decision I think that they want to have vetted through the White House or through a candidate even. I mean, I think Buttigieg sort of gestured at that as you're saying, like, it's, this person came from my family. He might also be talking about your family or your kid's family or your friend's family. Like, this is something that there isn't necessarily like a political constituency around because it crosses so many different communities. Like you said, queer and trans communities, single parents, people across the race and ethnicity spectrum. Like, I think there's a lot of people who stand to be pissed off from being told, actually your family is illegitimate, right? That's fundamentally what he's saying. Your family is illegitimate. And I think maybe they won't consciously register it this way, but it's a sort of supremacy ideology of Vance's that's showing up in that moment. And I think it also gives you a hint of like, well, if this guy wants this level of power and control over the people in this country, like what else might this person want to have? Like, I don't think it remains just isolated to families and sexuality and child rearing, that, if somebody has those controlling values, they are going to be controlling values that are expressed throughout their politics.
There's one other thing that Buttigieg got at here as well, which is, if you want to have a conversation about who has a stake in our future, well, this is the debate Kamala Harris wants to have with Trump. I want to point out that in her first speech as presumptive nominee, and folks, I have a piece on this up at TNR.com, so please check this out. She went out of the way to contrast her future vision with Trump's on the issue of reproductive freedom, saying Trump would nationally ban abortion, whereas Harris and Democrats would seek to codify abortion rights nationally. I mean, it seems like what Buttigieg is essentially saying is that, bring it on. Let's have a conversation about which vision of the future is better for American families. Isn't that an argument Harris can win?
Absolutely. I mean, it's heartening to see that she's coming right out the gate by centering abortion and centering reproductive freedom. I know she was out since January, sort of being the reproductive freedom standard bearer for the Biden campaign. So it's not like this is new coming from her. And having sort of reviewed some of her statements over the years, as I've been reporting, like, she seems so much more fluent in talking about abortion. She has a comfort with it. And I think also, I don't know if it's a generational thing, like, because there are plenty of people of Biden's generation who aren't as flummoxed by talking about abortion, but it just feels authentic coming from her. Like, when I hear her talk about abortion, I feel like you're somebody who sat down with reproductive rights activists. You're somebody who, whether you've had an abortion or people who've had an abortion, like, you just understand the stakes of this in a different way. And that's not even necessarily about gender. I just think that, like, there's an openness from her. It's destigmatizing abortion. When she spoke in front of the Planned Parenthood a couple of months ago, one of the things she talked about is, this is a place where people deserve to have care with dignity. This is going far beyond just the sort of outmoded, safe, legal, and rare way of talking about this, and to connect it also to broader issues of freedom and who belongs in this country. I think that's absolutely winning, because you can't isolate these things from one another. And increasingly, most people don't think of these things in silos, right? Like, we understand that what made Dobbs possible was an erosion of democracy itself, that they could not actually take abortion rights away from us without also corrupting the court in the process. And I think that bringing these things together is very powerful. And I think that it hits right to the heart of the Trump-Vance worldview, which is that, these, like I was saying earlier, like, all these controlling ethos, all this controlling politics go together, whether that's controlling who gets to be a citizen, whether that's controlling who gets to have a family, how you have that family, controlling if you get to vote. It's all connected. And I think that particularly with younger voters, it feels really resonant. That's what I keep hearing from folks. Like, she's talking just like a normal person. Like, she's talking about politics the way we talk about politics. There's plenty of issues with her as well, but just in this sort of first blush of like, it just feels like such a contrast to have someone who feels so comfortable talking about abortion and putting it in the context of the threat to democracy and to freedom.
What you said there, she sounds normal, is so key, because he does not sound normal. He sounds, frankly, sometimes like a bit of a freak on this stuff. And I just want to point out that this contrast she can draw between the need to treat people's private decision-making with dignity versus Vance's seething, almost bottomless contempt and anger at people who want to carve out that space for themselves is a very powerful one.
Yeah, he just looks like a freak. Like, and then, not to use that pejoratively in his sense, but just like in the sense of like where our politics are at and what people, believe. I don't know what people want to believe the norm is, whether or not it is the norm. Like, the norm should not be calling the vice president of the United States a miserable cat lady. It should not be calling any woman a miserable cat lady. And plenty of people pushed back on that and had fun with that because it's just so absurd. It's so ridiculous. It feels like the kind of thing you'd see on like an incel forum. It is like not the center of our politics, nor should it be. And the thing that comes across to me when I went back and watched that clip on Tucker Carlson when Vance says this is he's like reveling in it. Like, he's having fun with it, which makes it even more bizarre and more sort of outside the realm of like how we want to be treating one another, or would hope we would want to be treating one another. It's something that he clearly is taking pleasure in making other people, or trying to make other people ashamed. I actually don't think it's very successful either at making people feel ashamed. And I mostly saw people, as it's come around again, in the last week or so, and people are making their own memes in response to it again. Like, it's just like childless cat ladies unite, like, this is ridiculous. Like, you're not good at this. Also, you're not good at these kinds of attacks.
I will tell you, there is one person who I'm positive knows this as well, and it's Donald Trump. He, if for all his immense flaws, seems to recognize that this is not strong political ground for his campaign to be on. Anyway, Melissa Gira Grant, thank you so much for this discussion. It was so interesting.
Thank you.
Folks, if you want to read more from Melissa Gira Grant, make sure to check out a new piece she has going up today at tnr.com about a new attack on Kamala Harris from the Christian right, which describes her as a Jezebel, and why that's more dangerous than you might think. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.